All right, we're going to get moving. I would like to both welcome and thank everyone for attending Quantcast's first in the Innovate webinar series. Today's topic will be how to thrive in the post-cookie era. There'll be about 45 minutes of presentation and 15 minutes of Q&A. Please register your questions as the presentation is going. I really look forward to a rich discussion post-presentation. My name is Travis Landrum. I will be your host and moderator. I've been with Quantcast for 6 years and today serve as our Vice President of North American Ad Sales. For those of you that aren't as familiar with Quantcast as you might want to be, or haven't had the chance to meet with one of our commercial team members lately, Quantcast is an audience intelligence and measurement company headquartered out of San Francisco. Combining machine learning, a privacy by design approach, and live data drawn from over 100 million online destinations, Quantcast provides software, information, and advertising services for marketers, publishers, and advertising agencies worldwide. Today, we are in 10 countries and have over 20 offices. A little bit about Peter before we get started. As Chief Technology Officer at Quantcast, Peter is responsible for the development of products which allow marketers and publishers to make smart choices as they are buying and selling effective advertising. Prior to joining Quantcast, Peter spent 12 years in the financial markets and has a PhD in machine learning. He's also been a great partner and a wonderful CTO in his time at Quantcast. And with that, I will push it over to Peter.
Thank you, Travis, and thank you everyone for taking time today to learn about a subject that's been close to my heart for a number of years now. Now, there's a lot of you there, and there's a lot of people with a lot of very different backgrounds. So I initially asked my wonderful partners in our commercial organization, hey, what level should I pitch this at? And I got some amazing advice. The first piece of advice was make sure it's not too in the weeds, keep it nice and high level and simple. That was followed about 3 minutes later by make sure it's not too surface level, people want to understand the details. And my favorite piece of advice, please pitch it at just the right level. So my goal today is to try and give a little bit of something to everybody. The person who taught me to present told me you should never do that, but I'm going to ignore that advice today. Thank you for the completely useless advice, my partners in commercial, but I do hope that everyone's going to get something from today. What I'm hoping for is that you leave here informed, inspired, and entertained. Informed meaning you understand a little bit more about cookies, understanding what all the noise is about at the moment, and more importantly, how you can cut through a lot of the noise. Inspired, you've got an idea about the current trends, what they may mean for the future, more importantly, what it might mean for your future and your business, and that you're entertained. There will be some jokes, see if you can spot them. All right, so we're going to start at the super high level, making sure it's not too in the weeds. The reason we're starting here is because I think often when we're worried about really detailed things, we forget the bigger picture. You miss the wood for the trees, as the great phrase points out. And when I mean high level, I want us to start at the ad-funded content economic model. We've got 3 participants in this economic model, and it's a beautiful economic model when it works well. You've got consumers who really want to exchange attention for content. You've got marketers who want to grab a piece of that attention in order to, and are willing to pay for that. This ad-funded economic model has seen some amazing amount of content produced. It's helped a new brands launch, and it's worked for hundreds of years now. And it's important to remember that this is the ecosystem we're in. Sometimes when we think about technology, we get right into the weeds and we forget that fundamentally, all of the technology that we build and produce is there to support this economic model. If you think about the 3 different participants in this economic model, the web users, the consumers, their goal is really just low friction access to quality content. We'll come back to that low friction in a minute because I think it's a really important thing to recognize when we start looking into the future. And their goal is really to maximize their content to annoyance ratio. Ads are annoying, logging into sites is annoying. And so we're seeing increasingly end web users just want to maximize that content to annoyance ratio. Publishers, their goal is really just to fund future content production, and they want sustainable profits. I spend a lot of my time talking to publishers on the Q for Publishers side of our business, and their biggest ask for me is to help them maximize not just today's profits, but the sustainable profits, which have been eroding for years now. And marketers, ultimately, their goal is to reach and influence audiences, and they measure that usually in some sort of a kind of return on investment. Now, this might seem super high level. The reason I'm starting here is because I think there's things that we need to recognize today. the internet's original sin was convincing the users that all content was free. So users naturally get annoyed. Hey, there's these ads all over the place, and they get annoyed. Well, what are you using my data for? And there's been a breakdown in trust. But I think that stems from the fact that the internet was great at giving frictionless access to content, but there was never that openness and transparency when it comes to, well, this needs to be paid for somehow. There's a great quote here that I read when researching this. Economic systems, their rules of engagement, and the resulting flow of capital shape participants' behavior and have dramatic impacts on the activity they support. The economic system of the ad-funded open internet has undergone many shifts in the few decades it has existed and will need to continue to evolve to survive. As I was researching this, I was searching. This is something I said a couple of years ago, and I think I'm right. I think it's really important to remember that the decisions we make impact this economic system. How you measure success has dramatic consequences on the behaviors that we support. I could talk on this entire subject for more than an hour. My one kind of takeaway here is just as you, particularly if you're a buyer in this ecosystem, beware the Cobra effect. The Cobra effect is the name given to a story from kind of British rule, kind of colonial India. And there was a situation in Delhi at the time where they had too many snakes, too many poisonous snakes. And so one of the people who was in charge of the city came up with a brilliant idea of deciding to pay people for these snake skins. They said, well, we'll just kind of crowdsource this problem, and we will pay people to bring in these dead snakes. And it worked really well to start with because the snake population went down. However, very quickly, some entrepreneurial people recognized catching one snake is fine. I get a little bit of money for that. How about I capture 2 snakes and bred them, and then I can have as many snakes as I want. And I'd take them in. And very quickly, these entrepreneurial people living in Delhi at the time were breeding snakes and getting quite a lot of cash for it. Now, of course, the people in charge of this system suddenly recognized, oh, no, that's not what we meant. So stop paying for snake skins, at which point the people who bred them released all the snakes because they were now valueless. And the snake problem in Delhi was worse after this kind of series of events. These things happen all the time. The incentives that you set, how you measure things directly impact the participants' behavior inside an economic system, and you often end up with unintended consequences. In this kind of ad-funded economic model, how we value this attention is really important. How marketers value that attention is important. If we just commoditize it all, then it's just a race to the bottom, and all ads appear the same, and therefore it's the lowest cost, and therefore we end up with high ad density. If you value just clicks, then we end up with click bots and a lot of fraud. Right, so how we value this attention is absolutely critical. If it becomes commoditized, I think that's bad for consumers and it's bad for publishers, and that means this economic model will not thrive. Right, now we've framed things right at the high level. We're now going to go right down into the details. We're going to get right into the details of what cookies are, and I promise you, I will connect these two things later on in this presentation. It might appear really abstract, but I promise you it will make sense at the end. So what's a cookie? So I think most of you are probably aware that a cookie is something that allows the kind of internet and how we use it to work today. When I go to the New York Times on my web browser, behind the scenes what's happening is I go to the newyorktimes.com web server, I go and fetch this kind of code here, this HTML, that then sets off a series of interactions between my web browser and the newyorktimes.com. Right, now this is today very, very complicated. In fact, why don't we just try it? My comms team told me absolutely not to do this live, but I'm going to ignore them. So if I go to New York Times here, as the page is loading, I got an amazingly targeted ad here for Quantcast Choice. I promise that wasn't set up. If I look here, anyone could do this in Chrome. You can kind of see behind the scenes, if I refresh this page now, there's a lot of these kind of connections going back and forth all over the place. This is as the web page is loading, connecting to all these different services, and we're doing a whole bunch of stuff. Now, in each one of these requests, down here, let's find one that's actually connecting to a New York Times thing here. I make a request and I get a response. That's not a very good one. My comms team was right. I should have prepared this and done a video. Where are we? This New York Times call here. There we go. I can say that on my request here, I've got my referrer, I've got my user agent. If I look at some of the other ones, I'm also passing what's called a cookie. and I'm responding with a cookie. Now, there are cookies here. This is what a cookie is. Each one of these is a cookie. It has a name, it has a value, and it has a domain that I send it to. What this means is every time I connect to this domain from my web browser, I'm going to send this set of kind of key value pairs, these kind of little names and these values over here. So every time this web browser connects to google.com, it's going to send this one, and there'll be some New York Times ones down here. It's going to send this little underscore CV here. Right. This kind of mechanism for cookies has been absolutely influential in how the web works. It's an amazing thing because it means that as I leave a site and come back, the site knows who I am, it knows what I've got in my shopping cart and everything else. And it's fairly fundamental. That's all a cookie is. It's just this little name and this value. And the mechanism of the internet, when I make requests from my web browser to someone's server, I send the cookies that are already there. And when it responds, it can say, hey, browser, I want you to set this cookie for me. I want you to set a New York Times cookie for me. So next time you connect to me, I want that bit of information back. So that's all a cookie is. It's a very, very simple mechanism. This is an example. I ask the New York Times for something. I pass it the cookie I've got, my ID. It will say in the response, hey, I want you to set this new cookie called session ID to ABC123456. There's a couple of other bits of information in there. But this mechanism is all we mean by cookies. They don't do anything more than this. They're simply these key value pairs that are tied to a domain, which means NewYorkTimes.com gets these all the time. A third-party cookie is simply a cookie that is sent to a domain other than what's in the top of the browser here. So if I connect to BuzzFeed.com, BuzzFeed.com is doing its own thing, it's setting its own cookies, but equally it might be connected to analytics.com, and exchange.com, and adserver.com. And at the moment today in Chrome, they're also setting their own little cookies. So exchange.com will be, it will be passing to exchange.com, your ID is 123456. Or if there isn't one, exchange.com will say, hey, your ID is this. The same with analytics.com. That's all that's meant by a third-party cookie. I had a weird conversation with somebody once who thought that third-party cookies are more complicated than this. That genuinely is all they are. The nice thing about this, from some people's perspective, is that as I move around the web, I now go to Forbes.com. If Forbes.com is also integrated with analytics.com and exchange.com, I can see those same IDs. So if I set them on the first website, I can see that it's the same person on the second website. That's all a third-party cookie is. And that third-party cookie is only good for that exchange.com. I can't, you know, by default send this to kind of everybody. So there's some good, there's some bad, and there's some ugly with these third-party cookies. The good is that they've powered things like measurement beyond impressions and clicks. They allow us to assign some value to attention. In that economic system, we don't just commoditize every impression to be worth the same and just get it as cheaply as possible. We can somehow value things like, has this type of activity led to sales, right? The nice thing about them is actually they respect things like incognito mode in your browser. When you clear your history, you get rid of all these IDs, and so all these are third parties having to start again. They're somewhat pseudonymous. They're not long-lived identifiers, so they go away relatively quickly. They support mechanisms like do not track, and they do power some targeting, particularly things like remarketing, making that attention more valuable to advertisers, which means they pay more, which means publishers get more sustainable revenue. It means end users end up with kind of less kind of ad density. The bad is actually, from some people's perspectives, they're not very long-lived. We'll talk about how long-lived they are today at the moment, but you can't track behavior over a long period of time. So actually truly measuring the value of an individual ad impression is very, very hard. They're hard for web users to control. There's been a breakdown in trust between web users in how cookies are used to kind of track them. They're not as reliable as many people think. Unfortunately, it tends to lead to too many lists, because ultimately we tend to think about people as identifiers, and I'll talk in a second about how people exchange these lists of identifiers, and they're not transparent to web users. And then there is the ugly about these things. Each of these domains has their own what we call identity space. So exchange.com might call a user ABC123, DSP.com might call them DEF345, DMP might call them FGH678. And so somehow we need to agree that this is the same browser, so that I can connect my data to my activation, to my inventory. And so we have this horrible system all over the web of agreeing, okay, I'm going to map my ABC123 to your DEF345 with these match tables all over the place, right? Which is kind of insane if you think about it. There we go. Right, so now we've gone right up to the high level about talking about what system we're in, the ad-funded economic model. We've gone right down into the details and talked about what cookies are. The rest of the presentation is going to be hopefully connecting those two things and why right now there's a lot of panic. Loading. I don't even remember what that slide was, so it can't be important. All right, so Google Chrome have recently made an announcement that within 2 years, Google will stop supporting third-party cookies. That's probably why the majority of you are here on this call today. What are people saying about that? Right now, we're at peak uncertainty. Some people are claiming contextual is the future. Some people are claiming, notably the Trade Desk are saying, hey, look, we're going to have even more stable identifiers tied to the actual device, and so we're going to be able to track people everywhere. Other people are claiming there's going to be login walls everywhere, and some people have been claiming you're going to have to pay for every piece of content. Other people are claiming there's going to be so much ad density, the internet as we know it is dead. There's a lot of noise right now. I think all of these claims are a little bit far-fetched. Skip all that. Why is my thing not loading? Okay. And broadly, there are two big threats to third-party cookies at the moment. I think it's important to separate them. The first one is one around users' trust. There is a lot of concern in end web users around how their data is used. We have not been transparent as an industry with what we are using people's data for, the value associated with it, and therefore how it enables them to have frictionless access to content. This has led to regulation. So in Europe, we've had legislation called GDPR, which effectively makes publishers and advertisers gain explicit consent from users in order to use their data. So this is annoying pop-ups all over the internet asking people, is it okay for us to use your data? The second one is big tech. Apple have made decisions to not allow third-party cookies, and now we've heard that Google have announced that these third-party cookies are going to go away as well within 2 years. However, this is not new. The internet today is already pretty dark. The internet today, if you look at it in terms of third-party cookies, looks something like this. On Chrome, which is about 50% of all cookies, a significant portion already we have no visibility into. And then gradually we kind of move up into this tiny fraction where we are able to track people over a long period of time. When we look at Safari, the vast majority of it's completely dark, using that third-party cookie mechanism to track people as they move between sites, which powers all of our attribution, it powers all our targeting today. And across the other browsers, things like Firefox and things like Microsoft Edge, again, there's a lot of kind of darkness. Each one of these boxes, the size of it represents a portion of internet traffic today. So you can kind of see almost half of internet traffic today has no cookies already. This is not a problem for 2 years' time. This problem has existed for some time already, and it's here today. And it's already dramatically impacting where, if you're a marketer, where your spend is going. So why is everyone panicking now? Well, I think there's broadly two reasons. The first one is this. The first one is this ad tech lumascape is largely glued together by these third-party cookies, agreeing on what identifier to use for an individual browser between a data supplier, a DMP, a data aggregator, a DSP, an exchange, and so on and so forth. This is all powered by these third-party cookies and these match tables all over the place. Now, I don't really like this, this lumascape view, partly because it puts us in this weird box called a DMP and data aggregator, which is definitely not what we do. But I do think it highlights the complexity and fragmentation of the ecosystem today. So to get data from a data supplier over here, they need to have a third-party identifier. They need to staple that with some DMP's data identifier. They need to staple that with a DSP's data identity space. Again, they need to map that to an exchange's data identity space before we can act on that at all. Right, so it very much is the glue that holds this fragmented ecosystem of lots of pieces of technology together today. So one of the reasons for panic with Google Chrome going the same way as Safari is that this very glue that holds it all together is eroding. It's eroding at an increasing rate now. The thing that's been holding it together arguably has been Chrome's stance until this point. And now we're going to have to start rethinking some of this kind of stuff. So if that's challenge number one, I actually think that's less important because my belief is that technology, all of this display lumascape, the same is true for video, our job as technology providers is simply to facilitate this economic model. Often we mistake these two things. I saw this in financial markets. Sometimes you think the goal is to support the system, not the economic model. arguably this is one of the causes of the financial crisis, the last big one, is that investment banks forgot that their job was to provide access to capital. Their job was to kind of make efficient flows of capital to support broader economic systems. And they were creating more and more complex products, which kept more and more of the cash down here. Right? The goal of ad tech has to be to facilitate this economic model, making it more efficient, more effective over time for all of the participants, the web users, the publishers, and the advertisers. So for me, when I think about the future beyond cookies, I do not think too much about solving for gluing together a fragmented ecosystem. I think there's a much bigger challenge that's ahead of us, and it's this. Today, if you are a publisher, the biggest predictor for the value you will get for an individual impression is how old the cookie is. Right, so for every dollar up here, a publisher will get for a kind of a nicely aged cookie, which is probably in Chrome or an old version of Internet Explorer, they get about 32 cents for something with no cookie. This cuts their revenue in 3. It's a third of the revenue they got. This is an existential problem for publishers. On the day of the Chrome announcement, I was able to set up meetings with every big publisher in New York because they recognize that over recent years, with Apple's moves, their CPM has been going down this curve fairly aggressively. And with Chrome, which arguably they're getting about 3 times the revenue they do today versus Safari, they can see it coming right down here. And they know that users are not willing to put up with higher ad density. So as that attention becomes commoditized because it's not measurable, we see this massive challenge to this economic system. To kind of overlay these two things, if you think of this as internet traffic today, turn that into the relative CPMs that people are kind of getting across these devices, you can see if all internet traffic looks close to Safari and nothing else changes, one of 2 things are going to happen. Either publishers can no longer sustain themselves in terms of ad revenue, so either going to go bust, they're going to start charging for content, or web users are going to have to put up with much higher friction kind of access to content. That might be higher ad density. That might mean forcing people to kind of log in and things like that. So this is a fairly existential challenge to kind of this economic model. If there's one thing you take away from today, it's that all of this is not about targeting. I often get asked the question, you know, what does this mean for targeting? It's about measurement. How we measure that attention is critical to support the economic system. And so before you start thinking about, well, how can we target in a post-cookie era? First ask the question, how are we going to measure in the post-cookie era? And when we think about the post-cookie era, just take Safari on iOS devices today. The ITP protected traffic today is the best proxy we have for how the internet's going to look in 3 years' time. So you can start today working out how we're going to measure this activity. I can promise you, if you're a marketer today, you are inefficiently spending. You will start seeing a lot of your budgets move away from iOS Safari because you can't measure it, right? Publishers feel this in terms of CPM. Advertisers are suffering because they're not reaching their potential audience in this medium because the way that we're measuring doesn't work on Safari. And they're either doing it explicitly and saying, look, I can't measure it, I'm not targeting them, or they're doing it implicitly. I care about measurable performance, and therefore over time, all of the spend will move away from these platforms where a lot of your potential customers are. So don't think about targeting, think about measurement. So what does a path forwards look like? I think we've got 3 problems to solve. I think it's how to measure, how do you alleviate challenges in your martech Frankenstack, and how to build a first-party relationship with your customers. I think this is something that anyone who is trying to reach and influence the audiences online needs to kind of think about these 3 things. So measurement. Third-party cookies are already insufficient for measurement in the open web. As I mentioned a second ago, advertisers are often unknowingly shifting spend away from ITP and ETP protected devices. ITP is iOS Safari, ETP is the kind of Firefox kind of equivalent. And without knowing it, you're probably not reaching and influencing audiences on those platforms. Equally, today, we see this a lot. Advertisers are often fighting over a small fraction of the audience. If you are trading in data, as in you're buying third-party data from some data aggregator, the biggest predictor of whether anyone is in a segment, even if it is an in-market segment, such as in-market for an SUV, is how old their cookie is. So they happen to have visited somewhere where someone's tagged and said, oh, look, they're in market for an SUV. There doesn't tend to be any time associated with it. And so the older my cookie is, the more segments I'm in, because people are buying based on these lists, you've got a lot of advertisers fighting over that, just that brightly lit up portion of the internet. Your growth is not there. Your opportunity is not more efficiently adding, weapons to that barrel. Your growth is dealing with the less measurable part of the internet, the dark part of the internet today. I do believe using ITP is the best predictor of how the whole internet's going to look like in 2 years. And that's nice, although nobody, even at Google, knows exactly how Google Chrome is going to work in 2 years' time. I think using ITP today is absolutely the best predictor. And most people claim that Google Chrome is not going to be as conservative, but I believe if you solve for ITP, you also solve for Chrome. So one thing I want to touch on here is deterministic versus probabilistic. There's usually a lot of confusion here about deterministic identifiers and probabilistic identifiers. Deterministic simply means things that we know. Third-party cookies allow us to say, we know that you visited Forbes.com on this URL, and we know you visited BuzzFeed.com at this URL. Right, this is like a deterministic way of dealing with data. And deterministic data sets are phenomenal because they tend to be very deep and very rich and very trustworthy. Probabilistic is simply things that we think. Informed decisions. They're guesses, if you like. The smarter you act with your guesses, the more accurate your predictions are likely to be, or the more accurate your thoughts are going to be. Now, today, with this third-party cookie lifetime distribution up here in the over 3 weeks, this is a kind of deterministic data set for how users move around the web, whether ads have influenced them. To deal with the rest of this, trying to get this is going to erode and it's going to all look like Safari. To only deal with this kind of brightly lit part of the internet does not allow us to actually do anything relatively sensible. What we need to do is to somehow shine a light on this portion of the internet. Now, one way of doing that would be to introduce a new deterministic identifier, have a login wall for the entire internet, if you like, where everyone gives us their email address in exchange for content, and that would allow us to have a nice, long-lived deterministic identifier. This is one of the advantages that Facebook has. They have this nice logged-in audience. You tell them who you are, you tell them what you like, and therefore they're able to measure things over a period of time. I don't see that happening anytime soon. We're starting to see in certain parts of the world, and I'll touch on this in a second, we are starting to see adoption of things like registration walls. We're starting to see adoption of consent walls and various other things. But I don't think that allows us to deal with all of this. And so rather than using the information that is deterministic, that we truly know about people, we're going to have to make some guesses when it comes up to here. My belief is that you need both. You need large deterministic data sets, that's things that you know, but you also need, in order to deal with the dark parts of the internet, you need to make some informed and smart and educated predictions. Where's that slide gone? Why are you loading? This is an important slide. Right, let's come out of here, see what's going on. What's gone wrong? I can see you in the small thing. Parts of this slide didn't load. So anyway, you've lost my graph. This is what happens when I change slides overnight. Let's just quickly get this up here. What we're going to do is I'm going to reload and see if that magically fixes stuff. Okay. Now, fortunately, we have the entirety of statistics on hand when it comes to making informed guesses. So dealing with the non-deterministic data is something marketers have to do every day. It's something that we all have to do every day. And thanks to coronavirus, we're starting to understand things like true positive rates and false positive rates with things like checking for antibodies better than we ever have before. But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, look, in the part of the internet that I don't know, can I predict whether this is the same person or not? Right? Can I have some insight? It might not be as perfect as the part of the internet that I can shine a bright light on, but can I at least give you some information? Unfortunately, as I say, we have statistics on hand. We've been solving this problem for decades and decades now in terms of trying to predict whether someone is immune to something or trying to predict whether someone's likely to take some action. And we tend to call these things classifiers. And you rank a classifier in terms of how accurate it is. How much am I trading the risk of being wrong to kind of the chance of being right? So as we kind of move up here, we shine a brighter and brighter light on the open internet, but it means we might be wrong 20% of the time. If you know that you're wrong 20% of the time, that's kind of okay, because you can factor that in as you start using this data. So getting our heads around how to use probabilistic data, I think, is absolutely critical. I think it's always been critical when it comes to marketing, because everything we do is probabilistic. But I think it's also going to be really important when it comes to things like identity, because it allows us to have information about whether our advertising is working on ITP protected devices. It allows us to value that attention. And today, this is one way that you can kind of look at these kind of things. And so a perfect classifier means that your guesses are right 100% of the time, and you're never wrong. These are very, very rare. In fact, I've never seen one in real life. And what you want to do over time is you want to have these kind of guesses get closer and closer to this perfect classifier. It means you're right most of the time and you're wrong occasionally, and you know where you are on the curve. So when I'm making some bets, when I'm making something, is this person in market for a product? Is this person the same person that saw the ad? I know where I am on this curve. So I know the chance of it being right and the chance of being wrong. That allows me to use things like Bayes' theorem and other techniques to add these numbers up to kind of help them make sense. This is where we kind of are today. If you use fairly simple, in fact, this is a little bit out of date now, but if you use fairly simple techniques based on just things like IP address, which you see in every request across the internet, you don't know things for certain, but you're able to build this kind of curve of identity. You're able to start shining a bit of a light on the dark part of the internet today. This was the first version of our probabilistic identity graph. We said, well, hey, look, let's understand what this looks like, and that can allow us to adjust for this. And it can allow us to start to understand how valuable attention is in environments where third-party cookies don't exist. This is a good example of this. When you do this, if you look at things like conversion rates across different environments, you see that Safari looks very low. The conversion rate here is very low. When I adjust it using this kind of approach, we start to see it looks very similar to Chrome, which kind of makes sense. Right? So in areas where it's not dark, we can simply adjust this, and we can start to understand, is my marketing working or not? You do need to make sure that you understand probability. You do need to aggregate the numbers in a sensible way to make sure you don't accidentally bias towards all this guesswork and various other things. But it's already possible today. This does not require years of R&D. We can lean heavily in terms of techniques that have been available in other domains for decades and decades now. So the first problem is how to measure. I think there's a whole bunch of stuff we can do today which will prepare us really well for cookies going away in the future. My belief is we do need large deterministic data tied together by things like email addresses. However, if we only deal in that, we're going to end up with some of the same challenges we have today, because I believe there's always going to be a portion of the internet which is going to have to be addressed probabilistically. And so we're going to have to make informed bets about this kind of stuff. The second challenge is, how do you alleviate the challenges in your martech Frankenstack? What I mean is this. Today, a lot of marketers are using all this different stuff that is glued together by these third-party cookies, and we glue together these deterministic identity spaces. It's like a game of telephone. Every one of these hops, I'm losing information. Every one of these hops, I lose fidelity, and I'm losing about 60% of the people in that kind of list. I think you need to go direct. I think the only solution to solving for this is to connect more directly. I do not think that the ad tech lumascape as it exists today will look anything like this in 5 years' time. Fundamentally, we need to more directly connect marketers with publishers and end web users in a much more sustainable fashion that is much less fragmented and relies on less identity spaces and less kind of sending stuff from one place to the next. To tell you what I think that means for us, one of the things that we've been doing is we've been working with a lot of our supply side partners and our publishers on our key publisher side, and we've just been integrating more directly. And where we're working exchanges, well, look, we've got our own view of identity. We need you to understand that this is a probabilistic identifier. We need to inject it on this side so that we know that we can target effectively. And increasingly, we're working with all of the top tier publishers, our Q for Publishers customers, who are awesome, and they've been partnering with us on this for the last year and a half now, just to connect more and more directly marketer spend into publishers, so that we don't need all of this other stuff kind of in the middle. Another area that we need to go direct is to understand audiences. One of the areas that we've kind of struggled historically is understanding things about audiences that we kind of can't observe directly. You can actually infer an awful lot about audiences from the type of content they're consuming online, but that's quite hard to put into human understandable terms. And so a lot of people use data from third parties to kind of tell you something else about that audience. no third party has yet convinced me that they are that they have a perfect solution or a good solution even to dealing with third party cookies going away. And so for the last 2 years, we've been working on new technology, something we call interest-based audiences. What this is cutting our dependence largely on third party data. We do this by, here's a tiny visualization of what I'm talking about. What we can do, thanks to the amazing advances we've seen in machine learning and computational power in recent years, is we can suddenly reason about massive data sets in meaningful ways. In this example, what we do is we scan the entire internet. We extract the text and content from every single page. We put them through language models, and that allows us to understand the meaning of URLs in terms of the topic and the content that is there. And so every dot in this kind of visualization, we've only got about, I think it's 8,000 URLs in this visualization, because that's all our visualization tool can use. In reality, there are tens of millions of dots, and it's over 768 different dimensions. Our visual cortex can only handle 3 dimensions, so we've got it here. But every URL is a position in space, and we use machine learning to move its position in space based on the topic and the content on that page. And this kind of stuff is possible today. This simply was completely impractical 10 years ago, but now we can reason about the internet in things like topic spaces based on the content of the pages, which means as someone hangs out down here, I can see that they're really interested in weather, for example. Now that allows us to tie our direct observations, how people are moving around the web, to positions in this kind of space. And as soon as we've got positions and coordinates associated with things, we've got the entirety of math at our disposal. And so we can use this understanding of the web to build new things which allow us to build audiences, not based on what some third party says, but based on drawing shapes in this space. We're going to be launching this to our early adopters next quarter. If you're one of our Q for Marketers early adopters, you'll be seeing this coming fairly soon. The internal version of this is a little bit ugly, but instead of starting with a third-party data segment and hoping it's right, we can just build audiences and say, well, look, I'm interested in people who are looking at SUV content, maybe something to do with Q7s, maybe they're looking at reviews for those kind of things. Now, this doesn't mean that these words have to be on the page. It just means that the language in the page has to be somewhere near this. If you really want to understand much more about this, come to my Machine Learning 101, where we go into exactly what we mean here. But I can build this topic. It will take maybe 10 seconds. And I can quickly validate and iterate on this by looking at, okay, these are the types of URLs. Is this the area in this space that you mean? Do you want to start saying, well, no, I want to shift the space? And the nice thing about using language models is we all understand words. And so I can shape and navigate the space using just words. It might take a few more seconds. I promise my early adopters, it will be quicker by the time you get your hands on this. But very quickly, we can start defining these audiences, not based on third-party data, not based on third-party cookies, but based on people's behavior online. And so I can create my SUV intenders. And as people move around the internet and they go to the SUV intenders, we can say, aha, we think this person with this probability is an SUV intender. And we can tie that directly to activation. When I talk about going direct, I think it's important for companies to work in areas where you can tie together identity, data, activation, and measurement as closely as possible. Because as soon as you decouple these things, you become more blind, you make worse decisions, and things become just a hell of a lot harder. So yeah, we can see some other words there where we can, okay, this kind of makes sense. Other words in this kind of space. I could click on these URLs and see them. I can see other words and things. Very early version of our tool, we are using this internally to replace almost all of our third-party data. There are some notable exceptions, things that we can't infer from online behavior, but a hell of a lot you can. So I can infer that someone's likely to be a database administrator by specific kind of language and things and URLs that they're using. And then I can say, okay, this is someone I understand. We're creating thousands of these segments, and more importantly, we're allowing our marketing customers to create these segments themselves to kind of understand things, not based on third-party data, not based on gluing things together and sending them from one place to the next, but based on where people are in kind of their content consumption space. We're really excited about that, and it's just one of the ways that I think we're all just going to have to go a little bit more directly connecting to the smallest number of systems that we possibly can to tie together identity, data, activation, and measurement. Okay. Now, the third thing that I think most businesses are going to have to do, certainly if you're heavily dependent on kind of web activation, is to build a relationship, a first-party relationship with your customers. I think people have been trying to do this for a number of years, and we've started doing this as well. For a long time in our business, we've had Q for publishers, and we've had Q for and our advertise business, and our forthcoming Q for marketers business. But now, since the advent of GDPR in Europe, we've started to almost accidentally establish a relationship with the end web users for the first time. So when GDPR was announced, there was a lot of panic, particularly amongst the publisher community, that if they had to get this consent from their end web users before they could monetize that traffic kind of eventually, then they were going to get, they could potentially go bust. So we partnered with the IAB, who did a fantastic job, a whole bunch of our publisher partners and our advertise partners across Europe. And we helped invent something called the Transparency and Consent Framework, which is simply a mechanism by which publishers and advertisers can remain compliant with legislation and regulation. It now supports CCPA and all regulations around the world. But unfortunately in Europe, it means we've got these annoying pop-ups everywhere. GDPR states that you need to get affirmative action. You need someone to actually click a yes button. You can't imply and say things like, by continuing to use this site, you are giving us the right to use your data. We're starting to see this refine a lot now. We're starting to see regulators come back and say, well, actually, we need to make the options look a little bit more like this. We need to give very granular controls to end web users. Now, we launched a free product called Quantcast Choice. And so now we have one of the world's largest consent management platforms. That's what these things are now called. We didn't know that's what they're going to be called when we built it. It means that pop-ups all over Europe today are powered by Quantcast. And we see billions of these all the time. And they're really annoying. So my advice, when you're building a relationship with end web users, do it carefully. It's fundamentally changed how we think about things. We realized that when we built this, we optimized too much for gluing the ad tech ecosystem together, and we optimized too much for the publishers and the advertisers, and we forgot about the end web user that makes all this possible. So in forthcoming versions of Quantcast Choice, we're really excited to be a little bit more transparent with web users, to allow them to kind of choose who gets their data, to be more transparent, choose when to be forgotten when they want to be forgotten, across initially Europe, and we're going to be launching this in the US next year. Having this relationship where you're transparent about what data is being used, allowing people to be opt out, allowing people to be forgotten when they want to be forgotten, ideally in a centrally administered place, we think is really important to make sure that economic system also caters to the kind of end web user. When I say carefully, we suddenly have seen our Twitter feed got nuts about people saying, this is really annoying, wouldn't be so bad if it remembered that I accepted it 50 times already. You literally see these pop-ups all over the place. So we will be making changes, obviously, to kind of help, but we don't like these little Quantcast sucks things, and that's a sign that we need to do better. And we're really excited, though, about establishing that relationship with the end web user and making it as frictionless as possible. Most people's complaint, we get over 90% click the kind of I accept button across Europe. Most people's complaint is not that. Most people's complaint is, hey, this is just adding friction to my access to content. We're seeing advertisers actually sit on more risk and not put one of these up, even though they are using web users' data, because there's that friction. It's increasing their bounce rate if they have this little annoying pop-up. We've iterated thousands of times and spent millions of dollars trying to make this as frictionless as possible, and we're going to continue to iterate in that direction. But I would advise anyone who's trying to build a relationship with your end web user, really, you're a human too, understand it, make it as frictionless as possible. We also get things like, this person seems to think we've broken their laptop. So yeah, people are fun. He was really nice again the next day. He asked nicely, and then we tried to help him fix his laptop. Turns out it was nothing to do with us. But this relationship with end web users is something new to us, but something we're certainly really excited about going forward. And I think it's these kind of mechanisms, these frictionless ways of being transparent with end web users, collecting consent to do what you want to do, ideally collecting information which is going to allow you to have a deterministic relationship, this deterministic identifier, such as an email address or a cell phone number with them over time, but doing it in a respectful way, I think is going to be something that all brands are going to have to lean into, and certainly all publishers. So how do you prepare? I think there's three things. Focus on measurement right now before you worry about targeting. Own your data and your consumer relationships. Think about it in human terms. Think about how you can collect, be transparent in terms of what data is being used. How can you establish that relationship in a frictionless way as possible? And thirdly, try and go direct. When you connect your data with someone else's, try and avoid the game of telephone and going through three different stacks. If you can directly connect your understanding of a customer measurement, with attribution, with activation, that becomes really powerful. I wouldn't be in marketing if I didn't have some sort of call to action. We are going to be launching the next round of our pilot program, starting with measurement for ITP protected devices. If you want to be part of that, or you're not already on our early adopter list, this is allowing you to measure the effectiveness of your ITP protected advertising today. Just email ITP@Quantcast, it should say .com on there, and we'll send you some more details and allow you to sign up to that. That's really allowing you to use all of the work that we've done in probabilistic identity to work out which of your ITP advertising is working, which is not. And we want to learn how to present information in this probabilistic space, which can be understood, interpreted, and trusted by marketers. So if you want to be part of that program, please do email us